King Alexander Edward Whitmore stood at the tall windows of his private study in Rosewood Palace, watching the morning mist rise from the palace gardens. At 62 years old, he had ruled the kingdom of Aldermere for nearly 15 years, following his mother's peaceful passing. His reign had been marked by stability, tradition, and what many considered a fairy tale romance with his second wife, Victoria Ashford. Victoria had entered his life during one of his darkest periods. His first wife, Queen Margaret, had died in a tragic car accident when Alexander was still crown prince. The loss had devastated him, leaving him withdrawn and reluctant to consider remarriage. But Victoria, with her warm smile, charitable nature, and genuine love for the kingdom's people, had slowly melted the ice around his heart. They had met at a charity gala for children's hospitals, where Victoria worked as a volunteer coordinator. She wasn't from nobility. Her father had been a successful businessman, her mother a teacher. But her grace, intelligence, and unwavering support during his transition to kingship had made her beloved by both Alexander and the people of Aldermere. Their wedding 7 years ago had been celebrated across the kingdom. Victoria had embraced her role as queen consort with enthusiasm, championing causes close to her heart: education for underprivileged children, mental health awareness, and environmental conservation. She had transformed parts of the palace into learning centers and regularly hosted events that brought together people from all walks of life. Alexander had often marveled at how effortlessly Victoria connected with people. Whether she was visiting a rural school or attending a state dinner, she possessed an authenticity that made everyone feel valued. The press adored her, dubbing her the people's queen, and her approval ratings consistently soared above his own. This morning, however, something felt different. Alexander had noticed subtle changes in Victoria's behavior over the past few months. She had become more secretive about her schedule, often disappearing for hours without explanation. When questioned, she would smile and mention meetings with various charities or personal appointments, but the details were always vague. His private secretary, James Thornfield, had also expressed quiet concerns. James had served the royal family for over 30 years, first under Alexander's mother and then under Alexander himself. His loyalty was unquestionable, but his recent careful observations had raised red flags. "Your Majesty," James had said just yesterday, "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I've noticed some irregularities in Her Majesty's movements. Phone calls that end abruptly when others enter the room, meetings that don't appear on any official calendar, and yesterday she left the palace for 4 hours with no security detail, something strictly against protocol." Alexander had dismissed James's concerns initially, attributing them to the man's naturally cautious nature. But as he stood in his study this morning, reviewing his own observations, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Victoria had always been passionate about her charitable work, often immersing herself completely in new projects. But this felt different. There was a secrecy to her recent activities that was unlike her usual transparent approach to her royal duties. The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted his thoughts. Victoria appeared in the doorway, radiant as always in a navy blue dress that complemented her auburn hair. At 48, she remained strikingly beautiful, her green eyes bright with the enthusiasm that had first captivated him. "Good morning, darling," she said, crossing the room to kiss his cheek. "You're up early today." "Couldn't sleep," Alexander replied, studying her face for any telltale signs of the secretiveness James had mentioned. "You seemed restless last night as well." Victoria moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where groundskeepers were already at work. "Just thinking about the children's literacy program. We're launching the new reading centers next month, and I want everything to be perfect." It was a reasonable explanation, and her passion for the literacy program was well documented. But Alexander noticed she didn't meet his eyes when she spoke, and her fingers nervously twisted the pearl bracelet he had given her for their 5th wedding anniversary. "Perhaps I could attend some of your planning meetings," Alexander suggested casually. "I'd like to be more involved in the programs that are so important to you." For just a moment, Victoria's composure seemed to slip. Her eyes widened slightly, and she turned back to the window before responding. "That's very thoughtful, Alexander. But you know how busy your schedule is. Besides, most of the work is quite tedious: budget reviews, site inspections, staff interviews. Nothing that would interest you." Again, her response seemed reasonable, but something in her tone made Alexander's instincts prickle. In their 7 years of marriage, Victoria had never dismissed his offers to support her work. In fact, She had always encouraged his involvement, believing that royal participation elevated the profile of charitable causes. Before he could pursue the conversation further, James Thornfield entered the study with Alexander's morning briefings. Victoria took this as her cue to leave, mentioning a 10 o'clock appointment that would take her away from the palace for most of the day. After Victoria departed, Alexander found himself unable to concentrate on the briefings. James, perhaps sensing his distraction, approached the subject that had been weighing on both their minds. "Your Majesty, about our conversation yesterday." James began carefully. "You still have concerns about Victoria's activities," Alexander stated rather than asked. James nodded gravely. "I'm afraid so, sir. This morning I discovered something that I feel I must share with you, though it pains me greatly to do so." Alexander set down the briefing papers and gave James his full attention. The older man had never been one for dramatics, and his obvious distress suggested something serious. "Yesterday evening, after Her Majesty retired, I conducted a routine security check of the palace communications," James continued. "All calls made from royal phones are automatically logged for security purposes, as you know. I discovered multiple calls to a number that doesn't appear in any of our official directories. Have you identified the number?" "Yes, sir. It belongs to a private residence in Millbrook Valley, about 40 minutes from the palace. The property is owned by a man named David Harrington." Alexander frowned. The name was unfamiliar to him, though that wasn't necessarily significant. Victoria interacted with hundreds of people through her charitable work. "Have you researched this David Harrington?" James's expression grew even more troubled. "I have, sir. He's 41 years old, divorced, and works as an architect specializing in community development projects. He has no apparent connection to any of the charities or organizations with which Her Majesty is officially involved." The implications of James's discovery hung heavy in the air between them. Alexander felt a cold knot forming in his stomach, though he tried to maintain his composure. "There could be a perfectly innocent explanation," Alexander said, though even as he spoke the words, he didn't entirely believe them. "Of course, sir," James agreed diplomatically. "However, I felt it was my duty to bring this to your attention, especially given the frequency of the calls, 17 in the past month, and their duration. Several have lasted over an hour." Alexander stood and walked to the portrait of his mother that hung above the fireplace. Queen Isabella had been a woman of unwavering integrity, devoted to both her husband and her kingdom until her dying day. She had often spoken to Alexander about the importance of trust in marriage, particularly royal marriages that existed under constant public scrutiny. "What would you recommend, James?" Alexander asked finally. "With your permission, sir, I could conduct a discreet investigation. Nothing that would attract attention or compromise Her Majesty's privacy unnecessarily, but enough to determine the nature of her relationship with this gentleman." The word relationship sent another chill through Alexander. He had never questioned Victoria's faithfulness, had never had reason to doubt her love and commitment to their marriage and to the kingdom. But the evidence James presented painted a troubling picture. "Do it," Alexander said quietly, but with the utmost discretion. "If there's an innocent explanation, I don't want Victoria to feel that her privacy has been violated unnecessarily." James nodded and withdrew, leaving Alexander alone with his churning thoughts. He tried to focus on his royal duties for the remainder of the morning, but his mind kept returning to Victoria's recent behavior, the mysterious phone calls, and the name David Harrington. By afternoon, Alexander found himself pacing his study, unable to concentrate on anything. When Victoria returned from her mysterious appointment, she seemed unusually animated, almost glowing with an excitement that made Alexander's suspicions deepen. "How was your day?" he asked as they sat down for tea in their private sitting room. "Wonderful," Victoria replied, her eyes sparkling. "We made tremendous progress on the Reading Center project. The children are going to love what we're creating for them." She spoke about the project with genuine enthusiasm, describing plans for interactive learning spaces and innovative teaching methods. But Alexander found himself analyzing every word, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. That evening, as they attended a state dinner honoring the visiting Prime Minister of neighboring Thornfield, Alexander watched Victoria charm their guests with her usual grace and wit. To any observer, she was the perfect queen consort, attentive, intelligent, and completely devoted to her royal duties. But Alexander noticed moments when her attention seemed to drift, when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. During the dancing portion of the evening, as they waltzed to music performed by the royal orchestra, He tried to recapture the easy intimacy they had once shared. "You seem distracted tonight," he said softly as they moved across the ballroom floor. Victoria looked up at him with surprise. "Do I? I'm sorry, darling. I suppose I'm just tired. It's been a very full day. Perhaps you should consider reducing your schedule," Alexander suggested. "You've been taking on quite a lot lately." Something flickered across Victoria's face. Annoyance? Fear? It was gone too quickly for Alexander to interpret. "My work is important to me, Alexander," she said with a slight edge to her voice. "Surely you understand that. These projects don't succeed without dedicated attention." "Of course," Alexander replied. But he could feel the distance between them even as they danced in each other's arms. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in their adjoining chambers, Alexander made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. After Victoria had fallen asleep, he quietly made his way to her private sitting room and began searching through her personal papers. He felt like a criminal, violating the trust of the woman he loved. But James's discoveries had planted seeds of doubt that he couldn't ignore. As king, he had responsibilities not just to his marriage but to his kingdom, and any scandal involving the royal family could have far-reaching consequences. In Victoria's desk drawer, hidden beneath charity reports and correspondence, Alexander found a small address book. His heart pounded as he flipped through the pages, looking for the name David Harrington. When he found it, written in Victoria's elegant handwriting, he saw not just a phone number, but a personal notation. DH, Tuesday afternoons, personal consultation. The phrase, personal consultation, sent alarm bells ringing through Alexander's mind. What kind of consultation would require such secrecy? And why would Victoria need to hide her interactions with an architect from her own husband? Alexander closed the address book and returned it to its hiding place, his hands shaking slightly. He had found enough evidence to confirm that Victoria was indeed in regular, secretive contact with David Harrington. But he still didn't know the nature of their relationship or the reason for the secrecy. As he made his way back to his own chamber, Alexander felt the foundation of his world beginning to crack. The woman who had helped him heal from his first wife's death, who had stood beside him through the challenges of ruling a kingdom, might be betraying their marriage vows. Sleep eluded him that night as he lay in bed, listening to the distant sounds of the palace settling around him. In the morning, he would have to face Victoria across the breakfast table, pretending that nothing had changed while waiting for James to uncover the truth about her secret meetings with David Harrington. The irony wasn't lost on him that as king, he commanded the loyalty of millions of subjects, but he might not have the faithfulness of his own wife. The thought filled him with a mixture of heartbreak and rage that threatened to consume him. By dawn, King Alexander had made up his mind. He would give Victoria one last chance to explain herself honestly. If she continued with her deceptions, he would have no choice but to act, regardless of the personal and political consequences. The truth, whatever it might be, would come to light. And, depending on what that truth revealed, the kingdom of Aldermere might soon witness a royal scandal that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. James Thornfield arrived at Alexander's private study at precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, carrying a manila folder that seemed to weigh far more than its physical contents. The king had barely slept, spending most of the night wrestling with scenarios that ranged from innocent explanations to devastating betrayals. "Your Majesty," James began, his voice carrying the gravity of someone about to deliver life-changing news. "I'm afraid what I've discovered is quite troubling." Alexander gestured for James to sit, steeling himself for whatever revelations were about to unfold. Through the windows, he could see the palace gardeners tending to Victoria's beloved rose garden, the same roses she had planted during their second year of marriage as a symbol of their growing love. "I conducted the investigation as discreetly as possible," James continued, opening the folder. "David Harrington is indeed an architect, but his projects focus specifically on private residential developments rather than the community centers Her Majesty mentioned. More significantly, I've discovered that Her Majesty has been visiting his property regularly for the past 4 months." Visiting his property? Alexander's voice remained steady, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped the arms of his chair. "Yes, sir. I positioned myself at a discreet vantage point yesterday afternoon and observed Her Majesty's arrival at Mr. Harrington's residence at approximately 2:30. She remained there for 3.5 hours. The words hit Alexander like physical blows. 3.5 hours at another man's private residence, with no security detail, no official business, and no truthful explanation to her husband. James reached into the folder and withdrew several photographs taken with a long-range lens. "I'm sorry to show you these, Your Majesty, but I felt you needed to see the evidence." Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he examined the images. The first showed Victoria's car pulling into a driveway beside a modest but well-maintained house surrounded by mature oak trees. The second captured Victoria at the front door, embracing a tall, dark-haired man who Alexander assumed was David Harrington. But it was the third photograph that shattered Alexander's remaining hope for an innocent explanation. It showed Victoria and David through a window, sitting close together on a sofa, her hand resting intimately on his arm while he spoke, both of them laughing with the easy familiarity of lovers. "There's more, sir," James said quietly. "I was able to speak with some of the neighbors without revealing my identity. According to Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who lives across the street, a woman matching Her Majesty's description has been visiting Mr. Harrington's home regularly since August." Mrs. Hartwell assumed it was his girlfriend, given their apparent intimacy. Alexander set the photographs down with deliberate care, his royal training helping him maintain composure even as his world collapsed around him. The evidence was damning, but a part of him still hoped there might be some explanation that would preserve his faith in the woman he loved. "Have you discovered anything about Mr. Harrington's background that might explain Victoria's interest in him?" Alexander asked. "I have, sir, and it's perhaps the most troubling aspect of this entire situation." James consulted his notes with the thoroughness that had made him invaluable to the royal household. David Harrington was married for 12 years to a woman named Sarah Harrington, née Collins. They divorced 18 months ago under what court records describe as irreconcilable differences. However, I was able to speak with a mutual friend of the former couple who provided additional context. Alexander waited, dreading what he was about to hear. According to this individual, Mr. Harrington has a pattern of pursuing women in positions of power or prominence. His ex-wife cited this as a major factor in their divorce. Apparently, he had affairs with a local news anchor, a city council member, and the wife of a prominent businessman. The source described him as charming and manipulative, someone who enjoys the thrill of conquest and the status that comes from associating with influential women. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Not only was Victoria betraying their marriage, but she appeared to have been targeted by a man who made a hobby of seducing prominent women. The thought of his beloved wife being manipulated by such a person filled him with a rage he hadn't felt since his mother's death. "Is there any indication of how long this has been going on?" Alexander asked through gritted teeth. "Based on phone records and neighbor observations, approximately 4 months. The frequency of contact increased significantly in October, around the time Her Majesty began displaying the behavioral changes you noticed. For months, Alexander tried to recall Victoria's demeanor during that time, looking for signs he should have detected earlier. Her increased interest in fitness, new clothing purchases, the subtle changes in her perfume, details he had attributed to her natural evolution as a woman now took on sinister significance. "What do you recommend as our next course of action?" Alexander asked. James hesitated before responding. "Your Majesty, this is a delicate situation that extends far beyond personal matters. Any scandal involving the royal family could destabilize the monarchy and damage our relationships with other nations. However, you also cannot allow yourself to be deceived indefinitely. Speak plainly, James. What are my options?" "You could confront Her Majesty directly with the evidence and demand an explanation. However, this approach risks an immediate crisis if she chooses to deny everything or, worse, decides to leave the kingdom entirely." Alexander considered this scenario with growing horror. Victoria's departure would create a media sensation that would overshadow everything positive his reign had accomplished. Alternatively, James continued, you could set a trap to catch her in an undeniable compromising situation, providing you with irrefutable proof and greater leverage in any subsequent negotiations. The word trap left a bitter taste in Alexander's mouth. The idea of actively deceiving Victoria, even in response to her own deceptions, went against every principle of honor he had been raised to uphold. "There's a third option," James added carefully. "You could have Mr. Harrington removed from the equation." Alexander looked sharply at his private secretary. "Are you suggesting something illegal?" "Not at all, sir. But there are legitimate ways to make someone's life very uncomfortable. Financial investigations, professional licensing issues, social pressures. A man with Mr. Harrington's reputation would likely find it difficult to maintain his lifestyle if certain aspects of his behavior became public knowledge." The suggestion had merit, But Alexander realized he needed time to think clearly before making any decisions. His emotions were too raw, his anger too fresh to trust his judgment completely. I want you to continue surveillance for another week, Alexander decided. Document everything: times, locations, duration of meetings, any physical contact you observe. But do nothing else until I give you explicit instructions. James nodded and gathered his materials. Of course, sir. Shall I continue to monitor Her Majesty's communications as well? Yes, but be even more careful. If Victoria discovers she's being watched, it could force her hand in ways we're not prepared for. After James departed, Alexander sat alone in his study, staring at the photographs that had destroyed his faith in his marriage. The woman in the images looked like Victoria, same auburn hair, same elegant posture, same beautiful face, but she seemed like a stranger. The Victoria he thought he knew would never deceive him so thoroughly, would never risk everything they had built together for an affair with a predatory architect. But the evidence was incontrovertible. His wife, the Queen of Aldermere, was having an affair. The remainder of the morning passed in a blur of state meetings and official duties that Alexander performed mechanically, his mind constantly returning to the photographs in his desk drawer. When Victoria appeared for their scheduled lunch in the palace's private dining room, Alexander found himself studying her face for signs of guilt or deception. You seem troubled today, Victoria observed as they shared a light meal of salmon and garden vegetables. Is everything all right with the trade negotiations? Her ability to lie so smoothly while looking directly into his eyes impressed and disgusted Alexander in equal measure. Here was a woman who had spent the previous afternoon in another man's arms, yet she sat across from him expressing concern for his well-being with apparent sincerity. The negotiations are proceeding well, Alexander replied carefully, though there have been some unexpected complications that required delicate handling. It wasn't entirely a lie. His marriage had certainly become a negotiation requiring delicate handling, though Victoria didn't realize it yet. I'm sure you'll resolve whatever issues have arisen, Victoria said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. You always do. The touch of her fingers, which had once brought him such comfort, now felt like a mockery. Alexander wondered if those same hands had caressed David Harrington's face just hours earlier. What are your plans for this afternoon? Alexander asked, testing whether Victoria would continue her deceptions. I have a meeting with the Literacy Program Committee at 3 o'clock, Victoria replied without hesitation. We're finalizing the curriculum for the new reading centers. It should take about 2 hours, possibly longer if we need to address budget concerns. Another lie, delivered with the same confidence as her expressions of love. According to James's surveillance, the Literacy Committee wasn't meeting today, and Victoria's car was expected to return to David Harrington's residence within the hour. That sounds important, Alexander said, his voice neutral despite the fury building inside him. I hope the children will benefit greatly from your efforts. I believe they will, Victoria replied, her eyes bright with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm for helping children, making her deception even more jarring. After lunch, Alexander retreated to his study and tried to focus on state papers, but his concentration was shattered. At exactly 2:15, he received a text message from James confirming that Victoria's car had left the palace grounds, heading in the direction of Millbrook Valley. The waiting became unbearable. Alexander found himself checking the time every few minutes, imagining what Victoria and David might be doing, wondering how she could betray their marriage so completely while maintaining such a convincing facade of loving devotion. At 4:30, James sent another message. Target arrived at subject's residence 2:35. Still present. Will update when departure observed. Alexander closed his eyes and tried to calm his racing heart. In a few hours, Victoria would return to the palace, probably glowing with the satisfaction of her secret rendezvous. She would kiss his cheek, ask about his day, and perhaps suggest they spend a quiet evening together watching a film or reading in their sitting room. The hypocrisy was staggering. How could someone lie so completely while living so intimately with another person? How could Victoria share his bed, attend state functions at his side, and represent the kingdom with apparent pride while simultaneously destroying their marriage? By 6 o'clock, Alexander had made up his mind. He would not confront Victoria immediately, but neither would he continue pretending that nothing was wrong. He would give her exactly one opportunity to confess her affair voluntarily. If she chose to continue lying, he would take decisive action. When Victoria returned at 7:15, claiming her meeting had run longer than expected due to complex budget discussions, Alexander was ready. "Victoria, I'd like to speak with you privately after dinner," he said as they changed for the evening meal. Something flickered across her face. Was it fear? Guilt? The expression was gone too quickly to interpret accurately. "Of course, darling. Is something wrong?" "We'll discuss it later," Alexander replied, turning away before she could see the pain in his eyes. Dinner was a torturous affair of polite conversation and forced normalcy. Victoria seemed unusually talkative, describing her fictional meeting in elaborate detail and expressing excitement about the literacy program's progress. Alexander wondered if her chattiness was nervousness or simply the satisfaction of someone who believed her deceptions were succeeding. Finally, they retired to their private sitting room, where Alexander had decided to give Victoria her last chance to salvage their marriage through honesty. "Victoria," he began carefully, "I've been concerned about you lately. You've seemed distracted, secretive about your activities. Is there something troubling you that you'd like to share with me?" Victoria's hands folded in her lap, and Alexander noticed the slight tremor in her fingers that she was trying to control. "I'm not sure what you mean, Alexander. I've been busy with the literacy program, but that's hardly secretive. You know how passionate I am about helping children. The literacy program requires you to spend entire afternoons away from the palace with no security detail." Now Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "Security isn't always necessary for committee meetings. The locations are perfectly safe, and constant protection can make other participants uncomfortable. What about the phone calls to numbers that don't appear on any official palace list?" Victoria stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to Alexander. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I make many phone calls in the course of my charitable work. Some are to individuals who prefer to maintain their privacy. Surely you're not suggesting there's something inappropriate about my dedication to helping others?" The deflection confirmed Alexander's worst fears. Even when directly confronted with evidence of her deceptions, Victoria chose to continue lying. Any hope he had harbored for an innocent explanation died completely. "Victoria," Alexander said quietly, "I'm going to ask you one final time. Is there anything about your recent activities that you think I should know?" Victoria turned from the window, and, for a moment, Alexander thought he saw something like regret or fear in her eyes. But, when she spoke, her voice was steady and convinced. "Alexander, I love you deeply, and I've always been faithful to our marriage and our kingdom. If you're having doubts about my commitment, perhaps we should consider counseling or some other way to address your concerns." The audacity of her response, turning his reasonable suspicions into a personal failing, ignited the rage Alexander had been suppressing. She wasn't just betraying their marriage. She was gaslighting him, making him question his own perceptions and judgment. "I see," Alexander said, his voice dangerously calm. "Thank you for clarifying your position." Victoria smiled, apparently believing she had successfully deflected his suspicions. "I'm glad we've talked about this, darling. Communication is so important in marriage." Alexander nodded, his decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. Victoria had chosen deception over honesty, manipulation over accountability. The woman he had loved and trusted had revealed herself to be someone else entirely, someone willing to lie directly to his face while destroying their marriage. The confrontation was over, but the war for Alexander's kingdom, his dignity, and his future had just begun. The next morning brought unseasonably cold weather to Aldermere, with frost covering the palace gardens like a crystalline shroud. Alexander stood at his bedroom window, watching groundskeepers clear ice from the pathways while Victoria slept peacefully in the adjoining chamber, apparently undisturbed by conscience or guilt. Her ability to sleep so soundly after lying so blatantly to his face revealed a capacity for deception that Alexander was still struggling to comprehend. The woman who had once been his refuge from the pressures of kingship had transformed into a source of pain more acute than anything he had experienced since his first wife's death. James Thornfield arrived precisely at 7 o'clock with the previous day's surveillance report. The folder was thicker than before, containing additional photographs and detailed observations that painted an increasingly damning picture of Victoria's affair. "Your Majesty," James began somberly, "yesterday's observations confirm the pattern we've established. Her Majesty arrived at Mr. Harrington's residence at 2:35 and departed at 6:45, over 4 hours." Alexander accepted the folder with hands that had grown steady through necessity. The photographs inside showed Victoria and David in various poses of intimacy, walking hand in hand through his garden, embracing on his front porch, visible through windows in what appeared to be passionate conversation. The most concerning development, James continued, is this photograph taken at approximately 4:15. Alexander examined the image James indicated. It showed Victoria and David standing close together beside David's car, Victoria holding what appeared to be a set of keys. House keys? Alexander asked, though he already suspected the answer. That would be my assessment, sir. The positioning and her careful handling of the keys suggests Mr. Harrington has given her access to his residence when he's not present. The implications were staggering. Victoria hadn't just embarked on a casual affair. She had established such an intimate relationship with David Harrington that she now possessed keys to his home. The level of trust and commitment this represented between them made Alexander's stomach churn with disgust and betrayal. There's additional information about Mr. Harrington that I believe you should know, James added, consulting his notes. I've discovered that he's currently facing significant financial pressures. His architecture business has struggled since his divorce, and he's behind on both his mortgage payments and his alimony obligations to his ex-wife. Are you suggesting Victoria might be providing him with financial support? It's possible, sir. The timing of their relationship coinciding with his financial difficulties could be more than coincidental. Additionally, I've learned that Mr. Harrington has been researching royal protocols and constitutional law extensively, visiting the public library multiple times to access materials about royal marriages, divorce proceedings, and succession laws. This revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. The idea that David Harrington was not just seducing Victoria, but potentially plotting to use their relationship for financial or social gain added a sinister dimension to the betrayal. He's researching divorce proceedings? Alexander asked, his voice deadly quiet. Yes, sir. According to the librarian I spoke with, he's particularly interested in the financial settlements involved in royal divorces and the rights of former royal spouses. The picture emerging was far worse than simple adultery. Victoria appeared to be involved with a man who was actively strategizing about the potential dissolution of her marriage, possibly with plans to profit from the destruction of the royal family. James, I want you to immediately begin a comprehensive investigation into any financial transactions between Victoria and Mr. Harrington. Check her personal accounts, credit cards, any expenditures that might indicate she's supporting him financially. I've already begun that process, sir. However, accessing Her Majesty's financial records will require careful maneuvering to avoid detection. Alexander paced to the window, watching the sun struggle to break through heavy gray clouds. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. His entire world had grown dark and cold, with little hope of warmth returning. Do whatever is necessary, but maintain absolute discretion. If Victoria discovers our investigation prematurely, she could take actions that would damage the monarchy irreparably. After James departed, Alexander forced himself to maintain his royal duties, attending a morning meeting with his economic advisors and participating in a video conference with allied leaders about trade agreements. But his mind remained fixated on Victoria's betrayal and David Harrington's apparent schemes. At noon, Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of waiting for more evidence or confronting Victoria again, he decided to meet David Harrington face to face. He needed to understand what kind of man had seduced his wife and what his ultimate intentions might be. Using his personal cell phone, Alexander called the number James had identified as David's direct line. The phone rang 3 times before a smooth, confident voice answered. David Harrington speaking. Mr. Harrington, this is King Alexander of Aldermere. I believe we need to have a conversation. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 10 seconds. When David finally responded, his voice had lost some of its initial confidence. Your Majesty, this is unexpected. May I ask what you'd like to discuss? I think you know exactly what we need to discuss, Mr. Harrington. The question is whether you're brave enough to face me man to man. Alexander could hear David's nervous breathing through the phone. When he spoke again, he was clearly trying to regain his composure. I'm not sure what you're implying, sir. If I've done something to offend the royal family, I assure you it was unintentional. Meet me at the Millbrook Cafe at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Come alone, and be prepared to have a very honest conversation about your relationship with my wife. Before David could respond, Alexander ended the call. He immediately contacted his personal security chief and arranged for discreet protection during the meeting, then informed James of his plans. Sir, are you certain this is wise? James asked, his concern evident. Confronting Mr. Harrington directly could provoke unpredictable responses. I need to look this man in the eye, James. I need to understand what kind of person my wife has chosen over her marriage and her kingdom. The afternoon drive to Millbrook Village gave Alexander time to prepare mentally for what promised to be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. The cafe Victoria and David had chosen for their clandestine meetings was a quaint establishment with outdoor seating that provided privacy while maintaining the appearance of casual encounters. Alexander arrived early and selected a corner table that offered clear sight lines while remaining discreet. He wore civilian clothes and a baseball cap, hoping to avoid recognition by other patrons. David Harrington arrived exactly on time, looking around nervously before spotting Alexander. He was indeed handsome in a conventional way, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of confident bearing that Alexander imagined might appeal to women seeking excitement outside their conventional lives. "Your Majesty," David said quietly as he approached the table. "I have to admit, this isn't how I expected my day to unfold." "Sit down, Mr. Harrington. We have much to discuss." David took the chair across from Alexander, his hands visibly trembling despite his attempts to appear calm. Up close, Alexander could see that the man was younger than he had expected, probably in his late 30s rather than 40s, with the kind of practiced charm that suggested extensive experience in manipulating others. "I assume you know why I'm here," Alexander began, his voice low but carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "I believe I do, sir. And I want you to know that I never intended for things to develop as they have." "Things?" Alexander's eyebrows rose. "Is that how you describe seducing another man's wife? Destroying a royal marriage? Undermining the stability of a kingdom?" David flinched at the direct accusations. "Sir, I understand your anger, but the situation is more complicated than it might appear. Enlighten me, Mr. Harrington. Explain how there could be any justification for what you've done." David took a deep breath before responding, and Alexander noticed his hands had stopped trembling. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of defiance that hadn't been present during their phone conversation. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, Victoria came to me. She sought me out, not the other way around." "Are you seriously suggesting that my wife pursued you?" "I'm not suggesting it, sir. I'm stating it as fact." David leaned forward, his earlier nervousness replaced by something approaching confidence. "Victoria contacted my office in August, claiming she wanted to discuss a community development project. But from our very first meeting, it was clear that her interests weren't entirely professional." Alexander felt his anger rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Continue." "She began making excuses to see me regularly. Personal visits to my home office, invitations to discuss projects over dinner, long conversations about her feelings of isolation and loneliness in the royal family." "Loneliness?" Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet. "Yes, sir. Victoria spoke extensively about feeling trapped in a role that didn't allow her to be herself, surrounded by protocols and expectations that stifled her natural personality. She said she felt more like a performer than a person, always having to maintain a perfect image for the public." Each word felt like a dagger to Alexander's heart. While he could dismiss David's claims as self-serving lies, the details rang true with observations he had made about Victoria's occasional frustrations with royal life. "She told you she was unhappy in our marriage?" David's expression grew more confident, as if he sensed that his words were having their intended effect. "She said you were a good man and a great king, but that your relationship had become more of a political partnership than a romantic marriage. She felt that you saw her primarily as a royal asset rather than as a woman with her own desires and needs." The accuracy of David's description stunned Alexander. These were indeed frustrations Victoria had expressed to him, though rarely, and usually during times of particular stress. The fact that she had shared such intimate details with another man felt like a violation beyond the physical infidelity. "So you decided to comfort her?" Alexander's voice dripped with sarcasm. "I offered her friendship and understanding. Someone she could talk to honestly without worrying about royal protocols or public image. And that friendship naturally evolved into an affair." David's mask of confidence slipped slightly. "Victoria is an extraordinary woman, Your Majesty. Beautiful, intelligent, passionate about making a difference in the world. The more time I spent with her, the more I understood why she felt constrained by royal life." "Answer the question, Mr. Harrington. Are you having an affair with my wife?" The directness of the question seemed to catch David off guard. He looked around the cafe nervously before leaning closer to the table. "Victoria and I have developed feelings for each other, yes. But it's not what you might think. She's not looking for meaningless excitement or trying to hurt you. She's a woman who's discovered that she wants something different from life than what she currently has. Something different? Like what? Freedom, sir. The ability to live authentically, to pursue her passions without constantly worrying about public perception or royal expectations. A relationship based on genuine love rather than duty and convenience. Alexander felt as if he'd been slapped. You think our marriage is based on duty and convenience? I think Victoria believes it has become that way over time. She loves the work she does for the kingdom, but she feels suffocated by the constraints of being queen consort. And you've offered her an alternative? For the first time, David smiled, an expression that revealed the predatory nature Alexander had suspected. I've offered her the chance to be herself, to explore what life might be like outside the golden cage of royalty. At what cost, Mr. Harrington? Her marriage? Her role in the kingdom? The stability of the monarchy itself? David's smile faded. Victoria is intelligent enough to understand the implications of her choices. Whatever decisions she makes will be her own. But you're certainly encouraging those decisions, aren't you? Particularly decisions that might benefit you financially. This accusation clearly caught David unprepared. His face flushed, and he looked away from Alexander's penetrating stare. I don't know what you're implying. I'm implying that you've researched royal divorce laws rather extensively. I'm suggesting that you understand exactly what kind of financial settlement a former queen might receive. I'm stating that you're a manipulative opportunist who has targeted my wife because of her position, not despite it. David's facade of confidence crumbled completely. Sir, I understand that you're angry, but you're making assumptions, am I? Alexander interrupted. Then, explain why a man facing bankruptcy suddenly becomes interested in constitutional law at the exact same time he begins seducing the queen of the realm. The accuracy of Alexander's accusation left David speechless. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly as he struggled to formulate a response that might salvage his position. Alexander leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Harrington. You're going to end your relationship with my wife immediately and permanently. You're going to refuse all further contact with her. And you're going to disappear from Aldermere entirely. You can't threaten me, David said weakly. This is a free country. I have rights. You have the right to face the full investigative power of the Royal Security Services, the tax authorities, the professional licensing boards, and every other governmental agency that might be interested in your business practices and personal conduct. Alexander stood, towering over David with the full authority of his position. You also have the right to explain to the national media how you systematically manipulated the Queen of Aldermere for financial gain. I'm sure that would do wonders for your reputation and your business prospects. David's face had gone pale. What if Victoria won't accept the end of our relationship? What if she chooses to leave you for me? The question revealed David's fundamental misunderstanding of both Victoria's character and the situation he had created. Alexander almost smiled at the man's naivety. Mr. Harrington, you've been very clever in seducing my wife, but you've made one critical error in judgment. You've assumed that Victoria would abandon her kingdom and her responsibilities for a relationship with you. But Victoria's commitment to Aldermere and its people runs far deeper than any infatuation. Alexander paused, allowing his words to sink in before delivering his final blow. When Victoria learns the truth about your research into royal divorces and your financial motivations, when she understands that she's been manipulated by a fortune hunter, her feelings for you will transform into disgust very quickly. David opened his mouth to protest, but Alexander continued relentlessly. You have 72 hours to end your relationship with Victoria and leave Aldermere permanently. If you're still in the kingdom after that deadline, you'll discover that kings still possess considerable power to make their displeasure known. Without waiting for a response, Alexander walked away, leaving David sitting alone at the table with his schemes in ruins and his future uncertain. The confrontation had provided Alexander with the information he needed, but it had also crystallized a painful truth. Victoria's betrayal wasn't just about physical infidelity. She had shared intimate details about their marriage with another man, expressed fundamental dissatisfaction with their life together, and allowed herself to be manipulated by someone who saw her as a path to wealth and status. The question now was how to save his marriage, his kingdom, and his wife from the consequences of her catastrophic misjudgment. Alexander returned to Rosewood Palace with his mind racing and his heart heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. The confrontation with David Harrington had confirmed his worst fears while revealing new layers of betrayal he hadn't anticipated. Victoria's affair wasn't just about physical infidelity. It was about fundamental dissatisfaction with their marriage and her role as queen consort. The 72-hour ultimatum he had given David would soon force a crisis that could destroy everything Alexander held dear. Either David would disappear and Victoria would be confused and hurt by his sudden abandonment, or David would confess to Victoria about their meeting, potentially driving her directly into the arms of her lover in defiance of royal authority. James Thornfield was waiting in Alexander's private study with additional intelligence that made the situation even more complicated. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid there have been several concerning developments while you were meeting with Mr. Harrington," James began, his expression grave. Alexander accepted a cup of tea with hands that he willed to remain steady. "Continue. First, I've confirmed that Her Majesty has indeed provided Mr. Harrington with substantial financial support. Over the past 3 months, she's made 4 separate transfers from her personal accounts totaling nearly £200,000. The amount was staggering. Victoria's personal allowance was generous, but not unlimited, and spending such a sum would require considerable planning and secrecy. How did she justify such large withdrawals? The transfers were coded as charitable donations to fictitious organizations that Mr. Harrington helped her establish. On paper, the money appears to be funding literacy programs and community development projects. So she's not just having an affair, she's committing financial fraud to support her lover. It appears so, sir. However, there's a second development that's equally troubling. I've learned that Mr. Harrington has been recording his conversations with Her Majesty. Alexander set down his teacup with deliberate care, fighting the urge to hurl it against the wall. Recording them? For what purpose? Unknown at this time, sir. But the implications are quite serious. If Mr. Harrington possesses intimate recordings of the Queen of Aldermere discussing her marriage, her feelings about royal life, or any other sensitive topics, he could use them for blackmail or public embarrassment. The revelation transformed the situation from a private marital crisis into a potential national security threat. In the wrong hands, intimate recordings of Victoria could destabilize the monarchy, damage international relationships, and provide ammunition for Republican movements that opposed the royal system. How did you discover this information? I have a contact in Mr. Harrington's neighborhood who noticed him purchasing sophisticated recording equipment several weeks ago. When I pressed for details, this individual mentioned seeing Mr. Harrington testing recording devices in his car and home. Alexander's confrontation with David suddenly took on new significance. If David possessed recordings of Victoria, the threat to leave the kingdom might not be sufficient to neutralize the danger he represented. "James, I need you to immediately contact our intelligence services. I want a full technical surveillance sweep of Mr. Harrington's property, his vehicles, and any other locations where he might have recorded Victoria." "Sir, such action would require careful justification to avoid questions about why we're investigating a private citizen." "Then, find a justification. National security, financial fraud, blackmail. I don't care what legal framework you use. I want those recordings found and secured before they can be used against the crown." Alexander walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where Victoria often spent quiet moments reading or planning her charitable activities. The woman he had loved and trusted had entangled herself with a criminal who was documenting her betrayal for purposes that could destroy them all. "There's one more thing, sir," James added reluctantly. "Her Majesty has requested a meeting with her personal attorney tomorrow afternoon. According to my sources, she specifically asked about the legal implications of royal separation and the rights of former royal spouses." The final piece of David's manipulation was falling into place. Not only had he seduced Victoria and extracted money from her, but he had convinced her to actively explore ending her marriage. The recordings would give him leverage over both Victoria and Alexander, while the legal consultation suggested Victoria was already planning her exit from royal life. Alexander's anger crystallized into cold determination. David Harrington had made the mistake of threatening not just a husband, but a king. The resources available to Alexander in protecting his kingdom were far greater than David could possibly imagine. "James, I want you to arrange a meeting with the Director of Intelligence, the Attorney General, and the Chancellor. Tell them it's a matter of national security that requires immediate attention." "Yes, sir. What shall I tell Her Majesty about your availability this evening?" Alexander considered the question carefully. Victoria would be expecting him to maintain their normal routine, But he wasn't sure he could sit across from her at dinner knowing what he now knew about her plans and David's recordings. Tell her I've been called away on urgent state business and won't return until tomorrow evening. I need time to finalize our response before I face her again. That afternoon, Alexander met with the highest levels of his government in a secure conference room deep within the palace. The Director of Intelligence, Margaret Ashworth, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had served under 3 monarchs. Attorney General Robert Blackwood brought constitutional expertise that would be crucial in navigating the legal complexities ahead. "Gentlemen, Director Ashworth," Alexander began, "I'm about to share information that must remain absolutely confidential until we determine our course of action." He provided a comprehensive briefing on Victoria's affair, David's background and apparent criminal behavior, and the potential threat posed by the recordings. The intelligence director took notes while the attorneys exchanged glances that suggested they understood the gravity of the situation. "Your Majesty," Director Ashworth said when Alexander finished, "this represents a clear threat to national security. If recordings of intimate conversations with the Queen become public, the damage to the monarchy's reputation could be irreparable. What are my options for neutralizing this threat?" Attorney General Blackwood consulted his notes before responding. "Legally, we have several avenues. The financial fraud provides grounds for criminal prosecution. The recordings, if they exist, could constitute illegal surveillance depending on consent laws. And if Mr. Harrington has used the recordings for blackmail or extortion, that opens additional criminal channels. How quickly could we move against him? We could have search warrants within hours and arrest warrants by tomorrow morning," Director Ashworth replied. "However, acting too quickly could alert Mr. Harrington to destroy evidence or release recordings prematurely." Alexander considered the delicate balance between speed and caution. Moving too slowly might allow David to escape with the recordings intact, but moving too quickly could provoke him into using them defensively. "I want surveillance teams positioned around all of Mr. Harrington's known locations immediately. Monitor his communications, track his movements, and be prepared to intercept him if he attempts to leave the kingdom or contact media organizations." "What about Her Majesty?" Chancellor Elizabeth Morrison asked quietly. "She'll need to be informed of these developments, particularly if criminal proceedings against Mr. Harrington become necessary." The question Alexander had been dreading. Victoria would have to learn not only that her affair had been discovered, but that her lover was a criminal who had been manipulating and recording her for his own purposes. "I'll handle Victoria personally," Alexander said. "But I need those recordings secured first. If she learns about the situation before we control the evidence, she might warn David or make decisions that compromise our ability to protect the crown." Director Ashworth leaned forward. "Sir, there's another consideration. If Mr. Harrington possesses recordings as we suspect, he may have already shared copies with associates or stored them in locations we haven't identified. Neutralizing him personally may not be sufficient to contain the threat. Then, we need to approach this systematically. James will continue monitoring Victoria to ensure she doesn't take any precipitous action. Intelligence services will map David's entire network of contacts and storage locations. And we'll prepare multiple contingency plans depending on what we discover." The meeting continued for 2 hours, developing detailed operational plans for various scenarios. By evening, Alexander had authorized the largest domestic intelligence operation of his reign, focused on protecting the monarchy from a threat that had emerged from his own wife's bedroom. As night fell over Rosewood Palace, Alexander stood alone in his private study, surrounded by the portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own crises and scandals. Some had survived through decisive action, while others had seen their reigns damaged or destroyed by personal failures and poor judgment. His secure phone buzzed with a message from James. HM attended dinner alone. Seemed distracted, but not alarmed. No unusual communications detected. Victoria was apparently maintaining her normal routine, unaware that her world was about to collapse around her. Alexander tried to imagine her reaction when she learned the truth about David's recordings and criminal behavior. Would she feel betrayed and manipulated, or would she blame Alexander for destroying her chance at happiness? At midnight, Director Ashworth called with the first results of the accelerated investigation. "Your Majesty, we've confirmed the existence of recording equipment in Mr. Harrington's residence and vehicle. Technical surveillance suggests he's been documenting his interactions with an unknown female for approximately 4 months. Have you recovered any of the recordings?" "Not yet, sir. But we've identified the storage systems he's using. We'll need search warrants to access them legally, but we could obtain the recordings within 24 hours of judicial approval. What about David himself? Where is he now? Under surveillance at his residence. He appears agitated and has made several phone calls to numbers we're working to identify. He hasn't attempted to leave the area, but our assessment is that he's planning something. The 72-hour deadline Alexander had given David was still more than 24 hours away, but it seemed David was already preparing his response. Whether that meant fleeing with the recordings or attempting to use them preemptively, Alexander couldn't be certain. Maintain close surveillance, but don't intercept him yet. I want to see what he does next. Alexander spent a sleepless night reviewing operational plans and considering the various ways the crisis might unfold. By dawn, he had made one crucial decision. Regardless of the personal pain involved, he would prioritize protecting the crown and the kingdom above saving his marriage. Victoria had made her choice when she began her affair. David had sealed his fate when he decided to record and manipulate the Queen of Aldermere. Now Alexander would make his own choice, and it would be guided by duty rather than emotion. The next evening, Victoria returned from her meeting with her attorney looking troubled but determined. Alexander was waiting for her in their private sitting room, having returned from his supposed state business with a course of action that would change their lives forever. "Alexander," she said, settling into her usual chair with unusual formality. "I'm glad you're back. We need to have a serious conversation." "Indeed we do," Alexander replied, studying her face for signs of the woman he had fallen in love with 7 years earlier. "I believe you have something to tell me about your recent activities." Victoria's composure faltered slightly, and Alexander could see her calculating how much he might know and how much she could safely reveal. "I've been doing a great deal of thinking about our marriage and my role in the royal family," she began carefully. "I've reached some difficult conclusions that I need to share with you. Before you continue, Victoria, I have something to share with you as well. Information that I believe will change your perspective significantly." Victoria looked surprised by his interruption, but Alexander could see a flicker of fear in her eyes as she realized the conversation wasn't going to proceed as she had planned. "I know about David Harrington," Alexander said quietly. "I know about your affair, the money you've given him, and the recordings he's been making of your conversations." The color drained from Victoria's face as the full implications of Alexander's words hit her. Her carefully planned speech about marital problems and personal fulfillment suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of his comprehensive knowledge of her deception. "Recordings?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Victoria. The man you believe loves you has been documenting your relationship for purposes we're still investigating. You haven't just betrayed our marriage. You've been manipulated by a criminal who sees you as a path to wealth and power." Victoria's hands began to tremble as the reality of her situation became clear. The romantic narrative she had constructed around her affair was crumbling, replaced by the ugly truth of David's manipulation and her own catastrophic misjudgment. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice breaking. Alexander looked at his wife, the woman who had helped him heal from his first loss, who had stood beside him through the challenges of ruling a kingdom, and felt his heart break completely. "Now, Victoria, we decide whether there's anything left of our marriage worth saving, or whether your actions have destroyed everything we built together." Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: shock, denial, fear, and, finally, a terrible understanding as the full scope of her situation became clear. She sat motionless for several minutes, staring at her hands while Alexander waited for her response. "Recordings," she repeated, her voice hollow. "David was recording our conversations? Audio and video, according to our intelligence services. Equipment sophisticated enough to capture intimate moments and private discussions about your marriage, your feelings about royal life, and your plans for the future." Victoria's composure cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her face as she realized the extent to which she had been manipulated and betrayed. "I trusted him," she whispered. "I told him things, private things about us, about my doubts and fears. He said he understood me in ways that—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "In ways that I didn't." Alexander's voice was gentle despite the pain her words caused him. Victoria looked up at him with eyes full of anguish. "Alexander, I never meant for any of this to happen. When I first met David, I was going through a difficult period. The press had been particularly critical of my charity work, suggesting I was too involved in political issues. I felt isolated and questioned whether I was truly helping anyone." "So you turned to a stranger for comfort instead of talking to your husband?" David wasn't a stranger, not exactly. He had done consulting work for one of our literacy programs several years ago. When I reached out to him about a new project, he remembered our previous interactions and was incredibly supportive and understanding. Alexander watched his wife struggle to explain her betrayal, and despite his anger, he felt a pang of sympathy for the confusion and pain evident in her voice. When did it become more than professional consultation? Victoria took a shuddering breath. It happened gradually. He would ask about my personal feelings regarding the projects, then about my life in general. He seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions, not just my title or position. And I didn't provide that kind of interest? You did, Alexander. But it's different when you're married to someone. There are assumptions, shared histories, unspoken expectations. With David, I could express doubts and frustrations without worrying about the implications for our marriage or your feelings. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on Alexander. Victoria had sought freedom from marital constraints by entering into an affair that had enslaved her to a manipulative criminal. When did the relationship become physical? Victoria flinched at the direct question. 3 months ago. I was having a particularly difficult day. The opposition party had criticized my environmental initiatives as politically motivated, and I felt like I couldn't do anything right. David invited me to his home for dinner, and you don't need to provide details, Alexander said, though part of him felt compelled to understand the complete scope of her betrayal. Alexander, I know there's no excuse for what I did. I violated our marriage vows and betrayed your trust. But I need you to understand that my feelings for David felt real and genuine. I believed he cared for me as a person, not as a queen. He cared enough to secretly record your intimate moments and research how much money he could extract from a royal divorce. Victoria's face crumpled as the full implications hit her. The recordings, what's on them? What did he capture? Alexander consulted the preliminary report James had provided earlier that evening. Conversations about your marriage, your feelings of dissatisfaction with royal protocols, your questions about whether you could be happy in this life long term. Also physical intimacy that would be devastating to the monarchy if made public. Oh God, Victoria moaned, burying her face in her hands. How could I have been so blind? So stupid. Because David Harrington is apparently very skilled at manipulation. According to our investigation, you're not his first target. He has a pattern of pursuing women in prominent positions, extracting financial and emotional resources, then moving on when the relationships become too complicated. Victoria looked up sharply. Other women? Who? His ex-wife, a television news anchor, a city council member, the wife of a prominent businessman. In each case, he provided emotional support during difficult periods, developed intimate relationships, benefited financially, then disappeared when the women discovered his true nature. I gave him money, Victoria said, her voice barely audible. Nearly £200,000 over the past 3 months. He said he was facing financial difficulties because of his divorce, and I wanted to help him establish his business so we could have a future together. The pain in her voice was genuine, and Alexander found himself struggling between anger at her betrayal and sympathy for her obvious devastation at learning the truth about David's manipulation. Victoria, I need to know exactly what you told David about our marriage, about royal protocols, about any sensitive information that could damage the crown if made public. Victoria spent the next hour providing a detailed account of her conversations with David. The scope of information she had shared was staggering. Intimate details about Alexander's personality and leadership style, internal family discussions about constitutional matters, her own doubts about the monarchy's role in modern society, and specific information about security protocols and royal procedures. He always seemed so interested in my perspectives, Victoria said miserably. He would ask thoughtful questions about royal life, encouraging me to examine my feelings about tradition, duty, and personal fulfillment. I thought he was helping me understand myself better. He was gathering intelligence about the royal family and your vulnerabilities, Alexander replied. Every question was calculated to extract information he could use later. As the evening progressed, Alexander began to understand the sophisticated nature of David's manipulation. The man hadn't simply seduced Victoria. He had conducted a detailed psychological operation designed to isolate her emotionally from Alexander while extracting maximum financial and informational benefit. What happens now? Victoria asked as the grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight. Alexander had been considering this question throughout their conversation. The personal dimension of the crisis, his marriage, his feelings for Victoria, their shared history, had to be balanced against his responsibilities as king and the potential threats to the monarchy. Several things must happen immediately, Alexander said. First, our intelligence services will recover all recordings and evidence David has collected. He'll be arrested and prosecuted for fraud, extortion, and violations of national security laws. And our marriage? Alexander studied his wife's face, looking for signs of the woman he had fallen in love with beneath the devastation and regret. That depends on whether you're willing to fight for it. Victoria looked surprised. You would consider staying married to me after what I've done. Victoria, you made terrible choices that have hurt me deeply and endangered the monarchy. But David Harrington manipulated you using sophisticated techniques designed to exploit your vulnerabilities. You're a victim as well as a perpetrator. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about what our marriage and our kingdom need to move forward. But there would be conditions. Victoria straightened, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since their conversation began. You would have to commit completely to rebuilding our relationship and your role as queen consort. No more secrets, no more separate emotional lives, no more questioning whether you want to be married to me. Either you're fully committed to our marriage and our shared responsibilities, or we end this now. What about the public? If David's recordings become known, they won't. David Harrington is going to discover that manipulating the royal family carries consequences he never anticipated. By tomorrow morning, he'll be in custody, and every piece of evidence he's collected will be secured. He'll fight the charges. He might try to release the recordings out of spite. Alexander's expression grew cold. Mr. Harrington will discover that his legal troubles extend far beyond his relationship with you. Financial fraud, tax evasion, breach of contract with previous clients. We've uncovered enough criminal activity to ensure he spends the next decade in prison regardless of the recordings. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of Alexander's words. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger. I want to fight for our marriage, Alexander. I want to prove that I can be the wife and queen you deserve. But I need to understand why you're willing to give me this chance. Alexander considered his answer carefully. Because despite your betrayal, I still see the woman who helped me heal from Margaret's death. The woman who has devoted herself to helping children and protecting the environment. The woman who has represented our kingdom with grace and intelligence. But also because David Harrington underestimated both of us. He thought he could manipulate you into leaving me for him, that he could profit from destroying our marriage. Instead, his criminal behavior has given us an opportunity to rebuild our relationship stronger than before. How? Because now we both understand what we could lose. You've experienced what life might be like without the stability and love of our marriage. I've confronted the possibility of losing you forever. Neither of us will take our relationship for granted again. Victoria nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face again. But these seemed to be tears of relief rather than despair. What do I need to do? First, you'll have no further contact with David Harrington. Our security services will handle all interactions with him from now on. Second, you'll work with our counselors and advisors to understand how you became vulnerable to manipulation and develop strategies to prevent similar problems in the future. And third, Alexander reached across the space between their chairs and took Victoria's hand for the first time in months. Third, you'll remember that you're married to a man who loves you enough to fight for our marriage even when you weren't fighting for it yourself. The next morning brought swift action against David Harrington. At dawn, teams from the Royal Intelligence Service and National Police executed search warrants at his residence, office, and vehicle. By noon, they had recovered extensive recording equipment, multiple devices containing audio and video files, and documents outlining David's research into royal divorce proceedings and financial settlements. David himself was arrested at 6:47 a.m. on charges of fraud, extortion, and violations of national security laws. His attempts to contact Victoria were blocked by palace security, and his demands to speak with media representatives were denied pending judicial proceedings. The recordings, when analyzed, proved even more damaging than Alexander had feared. David had captured not only intimate conversations and physical encounters, but also detailed discussions about royal security measures, succession planning, and internal family dynamics that could have compromised the monarchy's safety and effectiveness. Victoria spent the day in meetings with intelligence debriefers, providing detailed information about every aspect of her relationship with David and helping analysts understand the full scope of the security breach. Her cooperation was complete and her remorse genuine, but the damage assessment would take weeks to complete. By evening, the immediate crisis had been contained. David was in custody, the recordings were secured, and the press remained unaware of the affair or its implications. But the larger question of Alexander and Victoria's marriage remained to be resolved. That night, for the first time in months, they sat together in their private sitting room without the weight of secrets and deceptions between them. Victoria had chosen to fight for their marriage, and Alexander had chosen to give her that opportunity. The road back won't be easy, Alexander warned. Rebuilding trust takes time, and there will be moments when both of us question whether we made the right choice. I know, Victoria replied. But I also know that what I had with David was an illusion built on lies and manipulation. What we have together is real, even when it's difficult. No more secrets, Victoria. No more separate emotional lives or questioning your commitment to our marriage. No more secrets, she agreed. And Alexander, thank you for seeing past my betrayal to remember the woman you married. I promise I'll work every day to be worthy of that faith. 6 months later, the Kingdom of Aldermere celebrated the 8th wedding anniversary of King Alexander and Queen Victoria with a renewed ceremony that captured the attention of the world. To outside observers, it seemed like a romantic gesture from a devoted couple. Those close to the royal family understood it as something far more significant. The public renewal of vows that had been tested to their breaking point, but had ultimately proven stronger than the forces trying to destroy them. David Harrington was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The recordings that might have brought down the monarchy were destroyed under judicial supervision, and his schemes to profit from royal scandal ended with his imprisonment rather than enrichment. Victoria's work with children's literacy programs expanded significantly, but now included Alexander as an active partner. Their marriage, forged anew in the crucible of crisis, had become stronger than either had imagined possible. The woman who had been shown the door had chosen instead to stay and fight for her kingdom, her marriage, and her future as queen. And the king who could have cast her out had instead chosen love over pride, forgiveness over revenge, and healing over destruction. Together, they ruled Aldermere with a wisdom born of nearly losing everything they held dear, proving that even royal marriages could survive the greatest betrayals when both partners chose love over fear.